Julius Caesar. The name itself is a monument, a colossus bestriding history. It's etched into our language, a synonym for empire, for power, for decisive leadership. From the Tsar of Russia to the Kaiser of Germany, his shadow looms, an eternal echo of ambition and conquest. We know the legend, the general who crossed the Rubicon, the dictator who was betrayed by his friends, the man who shaped Rome and, by extension, the Western world. He's the subject of countless plays, films, and books, a figure so grand he almost feels more myth than man. But what if the story you've been told, the tragedy of the noble conspirators against the tyrant, is merely the most enduring fabrication in Roman history? What if the greatest lie wasn't about who killed Caesar, but why? And more profoundly, what if the true deception began not in the Senate house, but within Caesar himself, long before the fatal daggers ever flashed? The Ides of March, a date forever stained red, seared into our collective memory. It conjures images of foreboding omens, of a soothsayer's chilling warning, of a wife's prophetic dream. Calpurnia, sleepless and distraught, had seen her husband murdered in her slumber, the pediment of their house collapsing, a vision so vivid it prompted her to beg him to stay home. A scroll detailing the entire conspiracy was pressed into his hand by a desperate informant on his way to the Senate, a final, clear red flag. Yet Caesar, the man who had mastered armies and outmaneuvered every political foe, ignored it all. He dismissed the soothsayer, calmed his wife, and chose not to read the urgent message. He walked into the Senate, into his fate. Was this hubris, a fatalistic arrogance, or something far more complex? A man, perhaps, consciously or unconsciously, inviting the dramatic end he believed solidified his own legend. To understand the man who would court such a destiny, we must peel back the layers of legend and return to his genesis. Gaius Julius Caesar was not born into the purple of absolute power, nor into the immediate wealth that defined many of Rome's elite. He belonged to the ancient patrician gens Julia Asterisk, a family line that proudly traced its ancestry back to Aeolus, the son of Aeneas, and through him to the goddess Venus herself. This was a lineage steeped in divine myth, a claim to celestial favor that offered immense social prestige but little in the way of immediate political muscle or vast personal fortune in his youth. His early years were those of a patrician scion, certainly privileged, but also burdened by the weight of immense expectation and the fading glory of his particular branch of the family. He was a young man of refinement, educated in Greek rhetoric, fluent in Latin, but not initially marked for the extraordinary path he would forge. He was a son of Rome, yes, but a Rome on the brink, a republic tearing itself apart with factional violence and ruthless ambition. Then came the storm that would truly forge him, the bloody proscriptions of Sulla. The dictator Sulla, a brutal pragmatist who sought to restore traditional senatorial power, began a systematic purge of his political enemies. Caesar, still a young man, was related by marriage to Marius, Sulla's great rival, and had even served as a priest of Jupiter, a position that tied him to the old order. Sulla ordered him to divorce his wife, Cornelia, Marius's daughter. Caesar refused, a defiant act that marked him for death. He was declared an enemy of the state, his property confiscated, his life forfeit. This wasn't a political setback, it was an existential threat. He was no longer a well-connected patrician youth, he was a hunted man, a refugee within his own homeland. He fled Rome, moving from hiding place to hiding place, often falling gravely ill, relying on the kindness of strangers and the subtle intervention of powerful friends who eventually pleaded his case with Sulla. The dictator famously relented, allegedly remarking that in Caesar there were many Mariuses, a chilling prophecy of the danger he would become. This near-death experience, this sudden fall from grace and privilege into the brutal reality of a proscribed man, was his crucible. It stripped away any illusions of inherited safety or the inherent justice of the Republic. It taught him the raw, unvarnished truth of Roman power. It was a zero-sum game, a constant struggle for dominance where weakness was fatal and mercy a luxury. In the old myths, heroes often journeyed to the underworld or faced trials in the wilderness, emerging transformed, imbued with new strength or divine understanding. Aeneas, Caesar's mythical ancestor, was driven by fate across treacherous seas, constantly tested before he could fulfill his destiny to found Rome. Caesar's flight from Sulla was his own personal descent, his period in the wilderness. He wasn't guided by a goddess's hand or foretold by prophecy in that moment of terror. Instead, it was a harsh, pragmatic lesson in survival. It taught him that status could be stripped away in an instant, that alliances were fluid, and that true security lay not in family name or tradition but in unassailable power. This wasn't a mystical awakening but a chillingly rational epiphany. To survive in Rome, one did not merely play by the rules, one rewrote them. He returned to Rome, not as the same young patrician but as a man fundamentally altered. He understood the precariousness of life, the fragility of political standing, and the absolute necessity of cultivating loyalty and influence. His ambition, once perhaps a gentle hum, now became a roaring fire. He began a meticulous, calculated ascent, deliberately cultivating popular support, leveraging his charm, his intellect, and his burgeoning military reputation. He spent lavishly, incurring immense debts, understanding that generosity, even borrowed, bought influence. He knew that the traditional avenues of power were insufficient for the scale of his vision or the depth of his newfound resolve. He shed the skin of the old patrician who relied on lineage alone and began to craft a new persona. The champion of the people, the charismatic leader, the man who would bring order to chaos. This was his personal breakthrough, his profound transformation. He ceased to be merely Gaius Julius Caesar, a descendant of Venus, and began the deliberate, conscious construction of Caesar, the destined ruler, the architect of a new Rome. He would no longer be a victim of circumstance, but its master. The transformation was not an overnight revelation, but a meticulously forged weapon, sharpened by every setback, every slight. Caesar, the master of circumstance, wasted no time in wielding it. He understood that to truly command, one must first possess a dominion vast enough to reshape and an army loyal enough to follow him into legend. His gaze, therefore, turned north towards the untamed lands of Gaul, a proving ground for ambition and a treasury of untapped resources. The Gallic Wars were not merely a series of military campaigns. They were the grand stage upon which Caesar performed his new persona. For 8 long years, he plunged into a brutal, relentless conquest, pushing the boundaries of Roman power and his own endurance. He wasn't just a general, he was the architect of bridges built in days, the strategist who outmaneuvered countless tribes, the leader who inspired unwavering devotion in his legions even in the face of overwhelming odds. He led from the front, sharing the hardships of his men, a stark contrast to the often distant patrician commanders. His dispatches, later compiled into commentaries on the Gallic War *, were not just reports. They were carefully curated propaganda, painting him as an invincible force of nature, Rome's destined savior. It was during these campaigns that the myth of Caesar truly began to entwine with the man. The tales told in the legionary camps, then echoed back in Rome, spoke of a figure almost touched by divinity. Like Aeneas, the Trojan hero from whom Caesar claimed direct descent, enduring immense trials to establish a new destiny, Caesar navigated treacherous landscapes and faced down monstrous adversaries. Aeneas, guided by divine will, carried the future of Rome on his shoulders through fire and war. Similarly, Caesar, through sheer force of will and military genius, seemed to embody a similar predestined purpose, fighting to expand and secure a nascent empire. This mythological framing, of course, served a powerful, rational purpose. It transformed brutal conquest into a divine mandate, the expansion of empire into a heroic saga. Caesar's legions, witnessing his unwavering resolve and strategic brilliance firsthand, believed in his almost supernatural luck and skill. His ability to rally his troops after crushing defeats, to maintain morale during endless winters, and to inspire a fanatical loyalty was not magic, but a profound understanding of human psychology, combined with an unparalleled grasp of logistics, engineering, and battlefield tactics. He rewarded loyalty generously, punished treachery swiftly, and always ensured his men felt seen, valued, and victorious. He was their general, their patron, their living god of war. As his fame and fortune swelled, so too did the apprehension in Rome. The Republic, already strained by decades of internal strife, watched with growing unease as Caesar amassed an army loyal only to him. The Senate, clinging to the fading illusion of its authority, saw not a savior but a growing threat to its very foundations. The moment of reckoning came at the Rubicon, a small river marking the boundary between Caesar's province and Italy proper. To cross it with his legions was an act of war against the Republic, an unforgivable transgression. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. Caesar uttered those fateful words, knowing there was no turning back. This was the ultimate manifestation of his transformation, his absolute mastery of circumstance. He was no longer reacting to events, he was creating them. The civil war that followed was swift and decisive. Pompey, his former ally and now his bitter rival, represented the old guard, the fading dream of a republic that could no longer govern itself. Caesar, with his veteran legions and his indomitable will, swept aside all opposition. His victory was not just military, it was a profound ideological triumph, a testament to his vision for a Rome united under a single, strong hand. Upon his return to Rome, Caesar's actions were revolutionary. He declared himself dictator, a traditional Roman office, but then extended it, first for 10 years, then in perpetuum for life. He initiated sweeping reforms, reorganizing the calendar, redistributing land to veterans and the poor, regulating debt, and even embarking on ambitious public works projects to beautify the city and provide employment. He brought order to chaos, efficiency to administration, and a clear, decisive direction to a state that had long floundered in partisan gridlock. He was the architect of a new Rome, just as he had promised himself he would be. Yet this unwavering pursuit of order, this single-minded vision, bred a terrifying certainty among the traditionalists. Caesar was dismantling the Republic piece by piece and replacing it with a monarchy with himself as king. The very word king was anathema to Roman sensibilities, a haunting echo of the oppressive monarchy overthrown centuries before. The Senate, accustomed to its own deliberations and the shared power of magistrates, found itself increasingly sidelined, its authority usurped by one man. Caesar, the champion of the people, was becoming Caesar, the absolute ruler, the tyrant. The whispers began, then grew louder. Caesar, they said, was like a god who had forgotten his mortal limits. He was Icarus flying too close to the sun, his wings of ambition melting under the scorching heat of absolute power. Like Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, Caesar was perceived to be stealing the very essence of Roman liberty, defying the natural order of the Republic. The rational explanation for this perception, however, was far simpler than divine hubris. It was the crushing weight of his ambition, his undeniable effectiveness, and his evident contempt for the antiquated systems that, in his view, held Rome back. His reforms, while beneficial to many, were enacted by decree, bypassing traditional senatorial authority. His clemency towards former enemies, while seemingly magnanimous, was interpreted by some as a subtle assertion of his unassailable power, a grand gesture from a monarch to his subjects. He accepted honors usually reserved for deities. His statue placed amongst those of the gods, his image on coins, a month renamed in his honor. He wore the purple of a triumphing general, even in the Senate, and sat on a golden throne. These were not mere symbolic gestures, they were overt declarations of a new paradigm, a fundamental shift in Roman governance. For those who believed in the sacred principles of the Republic, these acts were not just offensive, they were existential threats. The Roman Empire's greatest lie was not a simple falsehood. It was a narrative meticulously constructed to justify an act of desperation. It was the urgent whispered fear that Caesar's unchecked power would destroy the very concept of Roman liberty, transforming a republic of citizens into an empire of subjects. The conspiracy that coalesced around figures like Brutus and Cassius was born of this profound fear, a desperate gamble to reverse the tide of history. They framed their impending act not as murder, but as sacrifice, a bloody plea to the gods for the restoration of the Republic. The lie was that by striking down Caesar, they could somehow resurrect a system that was already dying, a system that Caesar himself had, perhaps unwittingly, exposed as irreparable. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, in a hastily convened Senate meeting at the theater of Pompey, the inevitable climax arrived. Surrounded by men he had once considered friends, men he had pardoned, men who owed him their lives, Caesar was attacked. 23 dagger blows, a storm of iron and ideology. Each thrust was a desperate affirmation of a fading ideal, a violent, futile attempt to turn back the clock. His death was not merely the end of a man, it was the final, brutal gasp of the Roman Republic and the bloody, paradoxical birth of the Roman Empire. The assassins, bathed in his blood, immediately proclaimed their act as a righteous deed, a liberation. But in reality, they had not saved the Republic. They had simply cleared the path for a more absolute power to rise from the ashes of the very man they had slain. The lie was born that day, etched in the blood-soaked stones of the Forum, that Caesar's death was a triumph for freedom, when in truth, it irrevocably sealed its fate.